I didn't have, oh man, okay. All right, I'm sorry, I'm recording this for online students and I forgot to turn my mic on. Online students, I'll go back and recap what you missed. Oh dear. I've been having such a hard time this semester doing this. We're eventually transferring everything to actual online pedagogy instead of just recording classes for students to listen to, but we're still kind of in the transition time, and I'm not doing so well with the transition. All right, number 4, thus Pali was more accessible to the average person, okay, because it was the street language. So why does Buddhism become a missionary religion? Because street language is also the language of the merchants, right? And so Buddhism was transferred, among other things, by the merchants who were traveling around doing interaction with other countries, other peoples, coming through. There was a lot of commercial, business stuff going on. And because Buddhism was in the vernacular, they were able to communicate that with people coming and going. And Buddhism began to spread. Yeah.
This was starting in India.
Yes. Okay. Yep. It started in India but didn't last long there. Yeah. And I think we can understand why. Hindus would reject the idea that an avatar of Vishnu would become, a dominant religion. But yeah. So here's an example that I found of 19th century Burmese, okay, and I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of that. It refers to a confession for Buddhist monks, and it's written on Pali on gilded palm leaf. And that was typical. Things would be written on things like palm leaves or some similar material. And as you can imagine, a palm leaf would be very brittle, but yet it would be attached to a piece of wood of some sort in order to give it stability. And fascinating language. It kind of almost reminds me a little bit of Burmese with the circular language. It's not quite the same, but very interesting. And this type of thing that would collapse and could be carried, pretty interesting. But that's the way the things were often written. So let's talk about these 3 types of Buddhism that we looked at on the map earlier, okay? Theravada. Now I'm going to give you a little trick to help you remember these because there are a lot of words to try to keep straight. Theravada was from the Pali language for teaching of the elders, but it was a very strict approach to Buddhism, and we'll talk more about what that meant. There are a lot of things tied into that. So if you think of the word thin and Theravada, Theravada was the thin or strict, narrow way. So think of thin Theravada, strict, narrow, as opposed to what we'll see with the Mahayana, which was much broader. Okay, so that's one way that can kind of help remember that. And again, that's this section down here in the red in Burma. That says Burma, better known as Myanmar today, so on. Okay? And that takes in about 70% of Southeast Asians. It's a huge, huge area. It's a highly populated area. Notice that Thailand is also in that group. Now, does that mean that everybody in these countries is a Theravada Buddhist? No, that would be an oversimplification, okay? The dominant group would be Theravada, but there are other groups there as well. It's also called, just to make it harder for you yet, it's also called Hinayana, which means small vehicle due to its narrow view of self-reliance in gaining liberation. Again, we'll come back to that. But small vehicle, the idea that it's the narrow way as opposed to the broad way, to use the words of Jesus, right? So Theravada, thin, strict, narrow way to get to illumination or eventual deliverance. Now, in contrast to Theravada Buddhism is Mahayana Buddhism. And that means great vehicle, because in contrast to the small, narrow way, there are many ways that you can attain enlightenment. Enlightenment's the ultimate goal, right? To get out of the system of reincarnation and all that. And Mahayana promoted various options to attain enlightenment, which obviously is going to make it very popular, right? Who wouldn't like a little bit more of a choice in how they get this done, okay? It's much more popular for that reason, less rigid. There are several forms and techniques for gaining liberation. This is probably not a fair comparison, but think in Christianity of the difference between liberalism and fundamentalism, right? Fundamentalism says there's one way, and people have to hear the gospel, they have to be saved in order to receive eternal life. Liberalism says no, it's not that way at all. It's just loving, God loves everybody, and you have to believe in Jesus, but if you've never heard of Jesus, it's okay, you do the best you can, God understands. Very broad. So again, that's probably not a fair comparison, but at least it gives you the idea. Okay? Then there's the Vajrayana, and that's a different one altogether. That means diamond vehicle. So you have small vehicle, great vehicle, diamond. It refers to Tibetan Buddhism, okay? Now, and this is the orange area, and you can see over here Tibet, Mongolia, okay? Does anybody happen to know what you call the leader of Tibetan Buddhism? Is a famous person in that part of the world. I'm sure you've probably heard his title before. He's the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama. Okay? In fact, when we went to Israel in 1999, man, that's been a long time ago. And we were visiting the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And just before we went up on the mount, we saw this crowd of people and some reporters that were making swiftly leaving the Temple Mount in this big group. And right in the middle of this group was a guy wearing a red baseball cap. And we didn't know it at the time, but afterwards somebody told us, you see that guy with the red baseball cap in that group? That was the Dalai Lama from Tibet. He was actually visiting Jerusalem the day we were there. But they didn't want anybody to know who he was. They just put him on in a baseball cap because they didn't want anybody shooting at him or something like that, He wouldn't be welcome by either the Jews or the Muslims, in that location. Very, very interesting. But hardly could see the guy, but that was the idea. But he's the leader, and I believe that the current Dalai Lama is said to be like the 12th or the 14th incarnation of Buddha or something like that. I mean, it has its own set of rules and regulations when it comes to Buddhism, okay? It emphasizes mystical practices. So you ever notice how many religions, even Judaism, remember we talked about a sect of Judaism that's much more mystical, emphasizes dreams and visions and things like that. It just seems like in most religions, even in Christianity, where do you find that? Where do you go in the broad group of Christianity to find groups that emphasize mystical types of things? Think of people who call themselves Christians but emphasize dreams, visions, miracles. Yeah, Pentecostalism would be something in that neighborhood, right? Right. Depending, there are some very extreme forms of Pentecostalism. It just seems like in any religion you find something like that. There are even forms of that in Islam. We'll talk about that later. Vajrayana, the diamond vehicle, employs elements of Mahayana and excuse my German. Actually, it's an indigenous Tibetan religion, but it looks like a German word. So it takes a certain group, an indigenous group in that region, and apparently that group became the source for some of these mystical views that come out of Tibetan Buddhism. So, the ones you're going to hear the most about are the first two. Thin, and by the way, how do you remember Mahayana? You can think of Ma as like many. Sorry if it helps. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it doesn't. Theravada, thin. Mahayana, many, or major, if you think of that word. Okay, it would help to remember that's the group that's more inclusive, more options for coming to enlightenment. Okay? Questions, comments, Rotten Tomatoes? At this point, you guys. All right. So who is Lord Buddha? Very interesting. Well, let's tell his story. Now, there are actually two ways to study the life of Buddha. And remember, as a backdrop, they're not concerned about all the historicity and details and accuracy and all that. There is a historical narrative about him that you can find. You can read about it, and our book presents that in a capsulated form. And then there are veils of tradition, which means that as the story goes along, there are traditional things that you throw in. Everybody does that. We use the illustration here, remember? What was the illustration we used in American history of how sometimes historicity isn't all that important, but what it teaches is? Yeah, George Washington chopping down the apple tree, right? Did it really happen? We don't care, but what matters is what the story teaches. He was honest. He was a man of integrity. So we tell the story. Was there was a Daniel Boone, was there Davy Crockett? It's easier to hit, and a lot of stories like this. So we even do that here in the West to some degree. And those are the kinds of things we mean by veils of tradition, things that color, that impact the story, that may be true, maybe not, but who cares? The story of, and you can see why we don't use the full name. It's a mouthful for us Westerners. Gautama Siddhartha. Siddhartha is given a name. There are the years that are proposed for his existence. So, biblically speaking, when would this have taken place? When would he have been born? What's going on in Israel's history? If he was born in 563, what was going on with Israel in 563? This is one of those more important dates that you should know about Israel's history. Where was Israel? Captivity. 586 was the final destruction of Jerusalem, and then they were there until 538 or 9. Okay? So he would have been born about that. 483, when he dies, takes us about, and this one we probably wouldn't know as well, this is around the time of Queen Esther. So Buddha allegedly dies historically around the time of Queen Esther in that story. Okay? Fascinating. There are, as part of this story, are the Jataka tales, which are poems regarding his former lives. Now remember, it makes sense that we would understand Siddhartha, Gautama Siddhartha as somebody who had lived many, many lives previously, right? He went through reincarnation just like everybody else. And so there are these tales that tell stories about his previous lives. He was actually born into the Kshatriya caste. Now, we studied the major caste systems in India last time, in Hinduism. And visitors, just to set the record straight, we had a guy, I heard a guy was attending once a conference where a guy who lived in India a large part of his life was talking about the caste system, and he made the statement, if you think you understand the caste system, God have mercy on your soul. And so there are allegedly as many as 20,000 different castes, but 4 major divisions. Do you remember which one the Kshatriya one is? Second one, right? You have the Brahmas, and these would be like the priests, the nobles, people like that. So, he was allegedly born, and near the Ganges River, North India. His father was a ruler who kept him from the sight of suffering. His father, as the story goes, didn't want him to see suffering, wanted him to live the good life, and be happy and prosperous and all that, okay? And so he didn't let him out of the castle. But, he's a curious kid. Comes a time in his life when he decides, I want to get out. So what happens? Well, after an arranged marriage, we can safely assume it was an arranged marriage, he wanted to go out and see his subject who lived out there beyond the palace. And he did, and this is the age of 29, and he begins to observe suffering. And there are 4 kinds of suffering, according to the story, that he observes, okay? And they're pictured here. The first one, old age. Now, that might not resonate with you right now. It's beginning to resonate with me. I'm 62. It's coming. Old age, suffering. And believe me, I'm feeling it today. My right knee, it was starting to feel a lot better, so I decided to go out and play basketball in my driveway last night. And I woke up this morning remembering that probably wasn't a good idea. And then sickness, of course, is another one. He saw sickness. The third one was death. Okay. And the fourth one was ascetics. Now, who are ascetics? What is asceticism? Like what? The monks? They would practice that a lot, yes. And what do we mean by that? If they practice asceticism, what are they doing? In its essence, asceticism is self-denial. Okay? Sometimes it's like things like fasting or abstaining from certain things. Sometimes in its more extreme forms, it involves whipping yourself, which is almost like masochism, but it's the idea of self-denial. And he saw that as a form of suffering. So what did he do when he saw these four things? He did what anybody would do. He asked two questions. Can you imagine? Guess what two questions he would have asked as he observed suffering? Yeah.
Why is it this way and how can I solve it?
Exactly. Those are the two questions that everybody asked. Why is this happening? Where did it come from, right? Source of suffering. And then the solution. Source and solution of suffering. So, like all the religions that we study, man is dealing with the problem of sin, pain, death, sickness, all those things. Taoism is the weird one that says, no, they're not morally right or wrong. Sickness isn't bad or good. It's just different. I mean, everything has to balance, okay? But he looked at that and he thought, okay, this had to come from someplace, and there's got to be a way to resolve this. Source and solution. So what happens? We have just a couple minutes. He leaves home eventually. Of course, he's married now, but in the Hindu culture, he would still be under his father's authority as long as his father's living. And he becomes a sannyasi. Ooh, now that goes back to Hinduism. Remember, that comes out of okay, this is going back a little bit. What was the second set of literature that came out after the Vedas? Later on came the Upanishads. And part of the Upanishad teaching was the idea that instead of just retiring and, going into seclusion, you become a sannyasi. And you can seek enlightenment faster by practicing self-denial and stuff like that, okay? So that's what he decided to do. He wanted to find the source of and cure for suffering. Source, solution. Where did it come from? How do we get rid of it? So he followed several gurus unsuccessfully, and then he became an extreme ascetic for 6 years. And so he figured, I'm going to cause myself personal suffering as a way of trying to figure out where it came from. If I can suffer myself, maybe this will help me to understand it and to overcome it. Now, I'm looking at that clock, which you guys really like me to do, but I should be looking at this clock. That clock's fast, okay? These guys are hoping I'm going to watch that clock. And you're wrong. He sat under a fig tree, and he heard a musician teach his student how to tune the sitar. Anybody here ever hear a sitar? I'm going to have to pause this for the online students because sometimes these YouTube videos mess up the recording. But you can see the online students. You can see the site there. Just find any site that has recordings of the sitar, and I'm going to play this real quick for the students.